What started as the most important day of her life quickly became something else entirely. When emergency sirens pierced through wedding vows, this bride in white made a choice that would leave everyone speechless, abandoning her altar not for cold feet, but for something far more heroic than anyone could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the small bridal suite at St. Catherine's Church in Pinehurst, casting delicate shadows across the hardwood floor. Natasha Brooks sat quietly before an antique vanity mirror, her reflection showing a woman of remarkable composure despite it being her wedding day. At 32, she possessed an understated beauty, auburn hair pulled into an elegant but simple updo, minimal makeup highlighting her naturally striking green eyes, and a serene expression that spoke of someone who had faced far greater pressures than wedding day nerves. Her wedding dress hung nearby, a modest but beautiful creation of ivory silk and vintage lace that had belonged to her grandmother. Unlike the elaborate designer gowns featured in bridal magazines, this dress told a story of family tradition and practical elegance. Natasha had chosen it not because she couldn't afford something more expensive, but because it represented something more meaningful than mere fashion. "You're awfully calm for a bride," observed Chloe Anderson, her maid of honor, as she carefully arranged the simple bouquet of wildflowers and white roses. Chloe had been Natasha's college roommate and had watched her friend navigate a decade of challenges with the same quiet strength she displayed now. Natasha smiled, adjusting the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's. "I've learned that getting worked up rarely improves a situation," she replied, her voice carrying a subtle authority that most people attributed to natural confidence rather than years of military training. The bridal suite was modest, a small room behind the church sanctuary with basic furnishings and a single window overlooking the cemetery where generations of Pinehurst residents rested. St. Catherine's wasn't a grand cathedral, but a humble community church with wooden pews worn smooth by decades of worshipers and stained glass windows that had been donated by local families over the years. It was exactly the kind of venue that suited Natasha perfectly. "You're awfully calm for a bride," observed Chloe Anderson. Her maid of honor continued as she arranged the final details of the bridal attire. "Your mom's been crying happy tears since she got here. She keeps talking about how proud your father would have been." Natasha's expression softened at the mention of her father. Sergeant Major William Brooks had been killed in action when Natasha was 19, an event that had shaped the trajectory of her entire life. His photo sat prominently on the vanity, a formal military portrait showing a man whose eyes held the same determined kindness that now looked back from his daughter's reflection. "He would have liked Isaac," Natasha said simply, picking up the photograph. "Dad always said the measure of a man wasn't what he accomplished for himself, but how he treated the people who couldn't do anything for him." Isaac Turner had proven himself by exactly that standard. A high school history teacher and part-time volunteer firefighter, he had none of the flash or ambition that might impress others, but he possessed something far more valuable: genuine goodness. They had met 2 years earlier when Natasha moved to Pinehurst to care for her aging mother, and Isaac had been the patient, understanding man who never pushed her to talk about the parts of her past she wasn't ready to share. The truth was, most people in Pinehurst knew very little about Natasha's background. They knew she had served in the military and that she worked remotely doing some kind of consulting work that allowed her to maintain her mother's house and live quietly in their small town. What they didn't know were the details that Natasha preferred to keep private, not out of false modesty, but because she had learned that her experiences often made people uncomfortable, or, worse, they treated her differently once they knew. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in,"
she called, and her mother, Diane Brooks, entered wearing a navy blue dress that complemented her silver hair and nervous smile. "Oh, sweetheart," Diane whispered, her eyes immediately filling with tears. "You look absolutely beautiful." Natasha stood and embraced her mother, feeling the slight tremor in the older woman's hands. At 68, Diane had weathered the loss of her husband and years of worrying about her daughter's dangerous career with remarkable grace. But today's emotions were clearly overwhelming her. "Are you ready for this?" Diane asked, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from her daughter's dress. "More than ready," Natasha replied, and she meant it. After years of uncertainty, danger, and constant movement, the idea of building a stable, peaceful life with Isaac felt like the greatest adventure she could imagine. Through the small window, they could see guests beginning to arrive at the church. The guest list was modest, maybe 60 people, including Isaac's family from the next town over, some of Natasha's army friends who had managed to get leave, neighbors from Pinehurst, and Isaac's fellow teachers and firefighter colleagues. There were no elaborate preparations, no wedding planner, no expensive photographer, just friends, family, and the simple ceremony that both Natasha and Isaac had wanted. Father Miguel Santos, the parish priest who had baptized Isaac as an infant, would officiate. The church organist, Mrs. Henderson, who had been playing weddings and funerals for 40 years, would provide music. Isaac's firefighter friends had decorated the sanctuary with simple white ribbons and the wildflowers that grew abundantly around Pinehurst in late spring. "I should go check on the boys," Chloe announced, referring to Isaac and his best man, Ryan Clark, who were presumably getting ready in the church office. "Make sure they haven't run off to Vegas or anything." After Chloe left, Natasha and her mother sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the gentle sounds of the church coming to life around them. Voices in the hallway, the creak of wooden pews as early guests found their seats, the distant sound of Mrs. Henderson running through her repertoire on the organ. "Your father always said you had the strongest heart of anyone he knew. Even as a little girl, you never backed down from doing what you thought was right, even when it was hard." Natasha squeezed her mother's hand. "He taught me that some things are more important than being comfortable." Neither woman could have imagined how prophetic those words would prove to be in just a few short hours, when Natasha would be called upon to demonstrate exactly what she meant in the most dramatic way possible. For now, though, they simply sat together, a mother and daughter sharing one of life's perfect moments before everything changed. Outside, the May afternoon was warm and gentle, with a light breeze that carried the scent of blooming dogwood trees and freshly cut grass. Pinehurst was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual harvest festival, and where people still left their doors unlocked. At least, that's what everyone thought.
The soft chimes of St. Catherine's bell tower announced the approaching ceremony as guests continued to filter into the modest sanctuary. Isaac Turner stood at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back, trying to maintain the composure that had served him well through 7 years of teaching high school students and countless emergency calls as a volunteer firefighter. Today, however, his usual calm was tested by something far more personal than any classroom disruption or house fire. "You clean up pretty well for a history teacher," whispered Ryan Clark, his best man, straightening Isaac's simple black tie. Ryan had been Isaac's friend since childhood, and like most people in Pinehurst, he knew Isaac as a steady, reliable man who coached the school's debate team and never missed a town council meeting. What made today special wasn't just the wedding, it was seeing his friend find happiness with a woman who clearly brought out the best in him. Isaac smiled nervously, his brown eyes scanning the gathering congregation. "Think she'll show up?" he joked, though there wasn't a doubt in his mind that Natasha would be walking down that aisle. In 2 years together, she had never once failed to keep her word, never once let him down,
never once made a promise she couldn't keep. "Are you kidding?" Ryan chuckled. "That woman once drove through a blizzard to bring your mom soup when she had the flu. She's not missing her own wedding." The church was filling with faces that told the story of their relationship. Isaac's mother, Patricia Turner, sat in the front pew wearing her best dress and the proud smile of a woman who had worried her 30-year-old son would never find the right person. Behind her, Isaac's colleagues from Pinehurst High School occupied 2 full rows, including Principal Johnson, who had granted Isaac a rare Friday afternoon off for the ceremony. The volunteer fire department had shown up in force, their wives and children filling another section of pews. These men had worked alongside Isaac for 5 years, responding to everything from barn fires to car accidents, and they knew him as someone you could count on when things got tough. They'd watched him light up whenever he talked about Natasha, though none of them knew much about her beyond the fact that she made Isaac happier than they'd ever seen him. On the bride's side, the gathering was smaller, but no less meaningful. Diane Brooks sat in the place of honor, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief that had belonged to her mother. Behind her, several neighbors from their street had come to show support, including elderly Mr. Jameson, who had appointed himself unofficial guardian of the Brooks family ever since Natasha moved back to town. But it was the presence of 3 people in the 4th row that might have surprised anyone who truly understood their significance. 2 men and 1 woman, all in their 30s, all carrying themselves with a particular kind of alertness that spoke of military training. They wore civilian clothes, but their posture, their haircuts, and the way their eyes automatically scan exits and potential threats marked them as clearly as if they wore uniforms. Sergeant Elena Torres had flown in from Fort Bragg, using precious leave time to attend her former commander's wedding. She sat between Lieutenant Jake Morrison, who had driven up from Virginia, and Captain Mike Sullivan, who had taken a red-eye flight from Colorado. They were among the few people in Pinehurst who knew exactly who Natasha Brooks really was, and their presence represented years of shared experiences that most of the other wedding guests couldn't imagine.
"She never mentioned she knew so many people," Patricia Turner whispered to her sister, noting the military bearing of the 3 strangers. "Isaac said she was in the army, but—" Mrs. Henderson began playing the processional, her arthritic fingers moving with surprising grace over the keys she had played for 4 decades. The melody filled the small sanctuary, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Conversations quieted to whispers and then to expectant silence as all eyes turned toward the back of the church. Father Miguel Santos took his place at the altar, his kind face beaming with the joy of someone who had watched Isaac grow up and was delighted to officiate at this milestone. At 65, Father Santos had performed hundreds of weddings, but there was something particularly satisfying about this one. Isaac was one of the good ones, a man who volunteered at the church food bank, who never missed Mass when he was in town, and who treated everyone from the church janitor to the mayor with equal respect. "Dearly beloved," Father Santos began, his voice carrying easily through the small sanctuary without need for amplification, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Isaac Michael Turner and Natasha Marie Brooks in the sacred bond of matrimony." As he spoke the familiar words, Isaac felt his nervousness melt away. This was right. This was exactly where he was supposed to be. In the church where he had been confirmed, surrounded by the people who mattered most, about to marry the woman who had somehow managed to make his quiet life feel complete. The church door at the back creaked softly as Chloe Anderson appeared, beautiful in her simple lavender dress, carrying a bouquet that matched Natasha's. She walked slowly down the aisle, smiling at familiar faces and nodding to Isaac with obvious approval. Behind her, barely visible through the still open door, Natasha waited with her mother for her own entrance.
In these final moments before everything changed, Pinehurst felt like the safest, most peaceful place in the world. The afternoon sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the wooden floors. The scent of spring flowers mixed with the familiar smell of old wood and candle wax. Children whispered to their parents, elderly couples held hands, and young families arranged themselves in pews with the comfortable ease of people who belonged. Mrs. Henderson transitioned into the bridal march, and every person in St. Catherine's Church rose to their feet, turning expectantly toward the back of the sanctuary. This was the moment they had all come to witness, the moment when Natasha Brooks would walk down the aisle to begin a new chapter of her life. None of them, not even those who knew her best, could have predicted that in less than an hour, this peaceful ceremony would be interrupted by an emergency that would reveal exactly who Natasha Brooks really was, and why the simple woman they thought they knew was actually someone extraordinary. As the wedding march filled St. Catherine's Church, Natasha appeared in the doorway with her mother beside her. The sight drew a collective intake of breath from the congregation, not because of elaborate finery or expensive accessories, but because of something far more striking. There was an unmistakable presence about her, a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from within as she began her walk down the aisle. Her grandmother's dress fit perfectly, the vintage lace catching the afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows. But it wasn't the dress that made people lean forward in their seats. It was the way she moved, with measured, purposeful steps that spoke of someone accustomed to command, someone who had walked into far more dangerous situations than a church wedding. Her posture was impeccable, her gaze steady and calm, and there was something almost regal about the way she carried herself despite the simplicity of her appearance. "She looks beautiful," whispered Mrs. Patterson from the third pew, though, like most of the congregation, she found herself studying Natasha with new curiosity. There was something different about the bride, something that set her apart from the other young women in Pinehurst, though few could put their finger on exactly what it was. Isaac's breath caught as he watched his bride approach. He had seen Natasha in countless situations over their 2 years together, working in her garden, helping her mother with household repairs, volunteering at the community center, but he had never seen her quite like this. There was something almost ceremonial about her bearing, as if she understood the gravity of this moment in ways that went beyond typical wedding day significance. In the fourth row, Sergeant Torres, Lieutenant Morrison, and Captain Sullivan watched their former commander with expressions that mixed pride and subtle amusement. They alone in the congregation understood exactly what they were witnessing. A decorated combat veteran, someone who had led soldiers through some of the most dangerous missions imaginable, walking down the aisle of a small-town church as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Think anyone here has a clue?" Torres whispered almost inaudibly to Morrison. "Not a chance," he replied, watching as Natasha passed elderly Mr. Jameson, who nodded approvingly at her dignified presentation. "They see a nice local girl who takes care of her mother." What the congregation saw was exactly that. A woman who moved to Pinehurst 2 years ago to care for her aging mother, who kept a modest house on Maple Street, who drove a practical Honda Civic, and who seemed to know an unusual amount about everything, from emergency first aid to home security systems. They attributed her competence to growing up in a military family, her calm demeanor to natural temperament, and her physical fitness to good genes and an active lifestyle. What they didn't see were the barely visible scars on her hands from shrapnel wounds, or the way her eyes automatically cataloged exit routes and potential threats, even in the safety of her own wedding. They didn't notice how she instinctively positioned herself to maintain visual contact with the largest groups of people, or how her breathing remained perfectly controlled despite the emotional weight of the moment. Diane Brooks walked beside her daughter with obvious pride, but even she didn't fully comprehend the extent of Natasha's military service.
She knew her daughter had been deployed multiple times, knew she had received several commendations, and knew the army had offered her significant promotions to stay in service. What Diane didn't know were the specific details of missions that remained classified, or the fact that her daughter had been personally decorated by generals whose names appeared regularly in news headlines.
As they reached the halfway point of the aisle, Natasha's gaze found Isaac's, and her entire expression softened. This was the dichotomy that made her so remarkable. She could be simultaneously the hardened professional who had made life and death decisions under enemy fire, and the loving woman who brought Isaac homemade soup when he was sick and remembered every story he told about his students. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Father Santos asked in the traditional manner. "Her father, though he is no longer with us, and I do," Diane replied, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. She kissed Natasha's cheek and took her place in the front pew, leaving her daughter to take the final steps to the altar alone. This moment, Natasha standing independently before making her commitment, struck several people as particularly fitting. Isaac's mother noticed how naturally her son's bride seemed to command attention without seeking it. Principal Johnson, who prided himself on reading character, found himself impressed by the quiet strength she projected. Even the children in the congregation seemed drawn to her presence, sensing something special about this bride that they couldn't articulate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Isaac took Natasha's hands in his, and for a moment, the church faded away around them. Here were two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Isaac had found a woman whose strength complemented his gentleness, and Natasha had found a man whose steadiness provided the peace she had spent years seeking. "Dearly beloved," Father Santos continued, "marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but with careful consideration and mutual respect." As the familiar words washed over the congregation, nobody could have imagined that within minutes the ceremony would be interrupted by events that would transform their understanding of the woman standing at the altar. They saw a bride in her grandmother's dress, holding wildflowers, promising to love and honor a high school teacher in a small-town church. They had no idea they were witnessing the wedding of someone whose courage under fire had saved dozens of lives, whose strategic thinking had been sought by military leaders across multiple theaters of operation, and whose commitment to service had earned decorations that few soldiers ever receive. The contrast between who they thought she was and who she actually was would soon become impossible to ignore. But for now, she was simply Natasha Brooks, bride-to-be, standing in a pool of colored light from stained glass windows, about to promise her heart to the man she loved.
Father Santos opened his worn prayer book, the pages soft from decades of weddings, baptisms, and funerals. His voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had guided countless couples through this sacred moment. "Isaac and Natasha have chosen to write their own vows," he announced, smiling at the couple. "Isaac, you may begin." Isaac reached into his jacket pocket, retrieving a folded piece of paper that he had rewritten at least a dozen times. His hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness about marrying Natasha, but from the weight of trying to put into words what she meant to him. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "Natasha, when I first met you, I thought I knew what I was looking for in life. I had my job, my volunteer work, my routine. I thought I was complete." His voice grew stronger as he found his rhythm. "But you showed me that being complete isn't about having everything figured out. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be better than you thought you could be." Several people in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. Mrs. Henderson, still seated at the organ, found herself getting misty-eyed despite having heard hundreds of wedding vows over the years. There was something particularly genuine about Isaac's words, something that spoke to the deep connection between these two people. "You've taught me that strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid. You've shown me that real courage is quiet, that it doesn't need to announce itself to be powerful."
Isaac paused, looking directly into Natasha's eyes. "I promise to support your dreams, to trust your judgment, and to love you not just in the easy moments, but especially in the difficult ones." Natasha's expression remained composed, but those who knew her well could see the emotion in her eyes. Isaac's words had touched something deep within her, acknowledging qualities about herself that most people never saw or understood. "Natasha," Father Santos said gently, "your vows." She didn't need notes. The words she wanted to say had been in her heart for months, refined through quiet moments of reflection about what this commitment meant to her. "Isaac," she began, her voice clear and steady, "you gave me something I didn't know I was looking for. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of someone who accepts all of me, even the parts I struggle to accept myself." The church was completely silent now, everyone leaning forward slightly to catch every word. There was something in Natasha's voice, an undercurrent of experience that suggested these weren't just pretty sentiments, but hard-earned truths. "You've never asked me to be anyone other than who I am. You've never demanded that I explain every scar or account for every choice that brought me to you." Her voice carried a subtle intensity that made several people in the congregation exchange curious glances. "I promise to protect what we're building together, to be your partner in all things, and to choose our future every day, no matter what else might call to me." The last phrase, "no matter what else might call to me," struck her military colleagues as particularly significant, though the rest of the congregation simply heard it as a poetic way of expressing commitment. Father Santos smiled, clearly moved by both sets of vows. "The rings, please." Ryan stepped forward with Isaac's ring, while Chloe approached with Natasha's. The simple gold bands caught the afternoon light, modest but meaningful symbols of the promises being made. "Isaac, do you take Natasha to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death you part?" "I do," Isaac replied without hesitation, sliding the ring onto Natasha's finger with hands that had finally stopped trembling. "Natasha, do you take Isaac to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death you part?" Natasha opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a sound pierced the air that made her blood run cold. It started as a distant wail, then grew louder and more urgent, the unmistakable sound of emergency sirens. Not just one or two, but multiple sirens, creating a symphony of urgency that spoke of major disaster.
The congregation stirred uneasily. In a small town like Pinehurst, sirens were rare enough that they commanded attention. But this wasn't the sound of a single ambulance or fire truck responding to a routine call. This was the sound of every emergency vehicle in the county mobilizing at once. Isaac frowned, his firefighter instincts immediately alert. "That's a lot of sirens," he murmured. But it was Natasha's reaction that truly caught attention. Her entire posture had changed in an instant. The serene bride had been replaced by someone else entirely, someone whose every muscle was coiled for action, whose eyes had gone sharp and calculating, whose breathing had shifted into the controlled pattern of someone preparing for combat. Then came the sound that made her heart race, a specific pattern of short bursts from the town's emergency alert system. 3 short blasts, pause, 3 more, pause, then a long continuous wail. Anyone who had lived in Pinehurst long enough knew this was the signal for the volunteer fire department, but Natasha recognized something else entirely. Her hand instinctively moved toward her ear, a gesture so subtle that most people missed it, but her military colleagues understood immediately. She was reaching for a communications device that wasn't there, responding to training that had been drilled into her through years of emergency responses. "Code Black," she whispered, so quietly that only Isaac heard her. The color drained from Isaac's face. As a volunteer firefighter, he knew that Code Black was reserved for mass casualty events, disasters so severe that they required all available emergency personnel and resources. It was the code they had drilled for, but prayed they would never hear. Over the sirens, a new sound reached the church, the distinctive whop, whop, whop of helicopter rotors. Multiple helicopters approaching fast and low. Through the stained glass windows, people could see the shadows passing overhead.
Helicopter medicals, Natasha said, her voice now carrying an unmistakable note of command authority. At least 3, maybe 4. Father Santos looked uncertain, his hand still holding the prayer book as he tried to decide whether to continue the ceremony or acknowledge the growing emergency. The congregation was becoming increasingly restless, with several people pulling out cell phones to check for news or messages. Then Isaac's pager went off. The sharp electronic beeping cut through the church's acoustics like a knife. As a volunteer firefighter, he carried the emergency pager everywhere, but it had been silent for weeks. Now it was screaming with the urgent tone reserved for all hands emergencies. He pulled it from his pocket, read the message, and his face went white. Chemical plant explosion at Westfield. Multiple casualties. All emergency personnel report immediately. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Westfield was only 15 miles away, but the chemical plant there employed over 300 people. If there had been an explosion? Natasha was no longer standing like a bride. Every line of her body spoke of someone who had received urgent orders and was already mentally preparing to respond. The transformation was so complete, so immediate, that several people in the congregation found themselves staring at her in confusion. "How many casualties?" she asked Isaac, her voice crisp and professional. "Unknown," he replied, still staring at the pager. "But they're calling for every ambulance in 3 counties." That's when everyone realized that this wasn't just any emergency. This was the kind of disaster that would test every emergency response system in the region, the kind of crisis that would require every available person with medical or emergency training. And standing at the altar, still wearing her grandmother's wedding dress, was someone whose expertise in exactly this type of situation was about to become impossible to hide.
The silence that followed Isaac's announcement was deafening, broken only by the continued wailing of sirens and the rhythmic thrum of helicopters overhead. Every person in St. Catherine's Church seemed frozen in place, processing the magnitude of what they had just heard. A chemical plant explosion with multiple casualties wasn't just a local emergency. It was a potential catastrophe that could affect thousands of people. Isaac stared at his pager, his face a mask of conflict. As a volunteer firefighter, he had sworn an oath to respond to emergencies. But this was his wedding day. The moment he had been planning for months was happening right now, and the woman he loved was standing beside him in her grandmother's dress, ready to promise her life to his. "Isaac," Ryan whispered urgently, "what are you going to do?" The question hung in the air, but it was Natasha's reaction that truly captured everyone's attention. She had gone completely still, her eyes distant and calculating. To most of the congregation, she appeared to be in shock. But her military colleagues recognized the expression immediately. She was running scenarios, analyzing resources, calculating response times and casualty loads with the rapid-fire precision of someone who had done this many times before. "Chemical plant," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "Westfield Industrial processes chlorine and ammonia. If there's been an explosion—" She trailed off, but her expression had grown increasingly grim. Father Santos cleared his throat uncertainly. "Perhaps we should postpone the ceremony, given the circumstances?" "No," Isaac said quickly, turning to Natasha. "We can finish this. The ceremony will only take a few more minutes, and then I can respond to the call." But Natasha wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking past him, through the stained glass windows where the shadows of more helicopters were passing overhead. Her trained ear could distinguish between different aircraft, medical evacuation helicopters, emergency command units, possibly even military support aircraft. The scope of the response told her everything she needed to know about the severity of the situation. "Natasha," Isaac said gently, reaching for her hand, "we can finish our vows." She turned to look at him, and for a moment her expression was heartbreakingly tender. This was the man she loved, the man who represented everything she had ever wanted in a peaceful life. Standing here with him, in this quiet church, surrounded by people who cared about them, should have been the culmination of all her dreams. But then another sound reached the church, the distinctive roar of military transport aircraft approaching. Heavy cargo planes flying low and fast.
Natasha's head snapped up, her entire body tensing with recognition. "Those are C-130s, she said, her voice sharp with sudden understanding. "Military transport. They're bringing in CBRN teams." "CBRN?" Father Santos asked, confused by the acronym. "Chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear," Lieutenant Morrison answered from the fourth row, speaking for the first time since arriving at the church. His presence suddenly made more sense to those around him. He wasn't just a friend from Natasha's army days. He was someone who understood exactly what they were dealing with. The implications hit Isaac like a physical blow. "Chemical contamination," he breathed. "That's why they're calling in military support."
Natasha nodded grimly. A chemical plant explosion with potential contamination isn't just a local emergency. If toxic gases are involved, if there's been a release of chlorine or ammonia into the atmosphere— She paused, calculating wind patterns and population density with frightening speed. The contamination zone could affect everything within a 10-mile radius, maybe more. The congregation was beginning to understand the scope of what was happening. This wasn't just a fire or an industrial accident. This was a potential environmental disaster that could threaten thousands of lives. Isaac's pager beeped again, and he read the new message with growing alarm. "They're evacuating 3 surrounding towns," he reported, "and they're setting up a field hospital at the county fairgrounds." "Field hospital," Natasha repeated, and something shifted in her expression. The internal conflict that had been building suddenly crystallized into a decision that everyone could see forming in real time. Chloe stepped forward, still holding her bouquet. "Natasha, you don't have to do anything. Isaac can go help, and we can reschedule the ceremony." But Natasha was already shaking her head. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "A field hospital for chemical contamination victims requires specialized knowledge. Decontamination protocols, treatment procedures for chemical burns and inhalation injuries, triage systems for mass casualties." She looked around the church, her gaze lingering on the faces of people she had come to care about. How many people in this county have that kind of training? The answer was obvious. Very few, if any. Isaac was staring at his bride with growing realization. "You have that training," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Natasha replied simply. "I do." Sergeant Torres stood up in the fourth row, her expression serious. "Ma'am, with respect, this isn't your responsibility anymore. You're retired from service." Natasha turned to look at her former colleague, and for a moment, the church saw a glimpse of who she really was. The quiet authority in her voice, the steel in her spine, the unmistakable bearing of someone who had commanded others in life and death situations. "Elena, how many people do you think are lying in that field hospital right now, waiting for someone who knows how to treat chemical burns? How many first responders are about to walk into contaminated zones without proper protocols because they don't have anyone to guide them?" The questions weren't rhetorical. They were the kind of rapid-fire assessment that Torres recognized from combat situations where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. Isaac's mother, Patricia, stood up from her seat in the front pew. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "What kind of training?" The moment had come. The careful privacy that Natasha had maintained, the modest life she had built in Pinehurst, the simple identity as Isaac's bride-to-be, all of it was about to crumble under the weight of an emergency that demanded everything she really was. Natasha looked at Isaac, her eyes filled with pain and resolution. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And in that moment, everyone in St. Catherine's Church realized that they were about to witness something extraordinary. A woman choosing duty over personal happiness, service over self, the needs of strangers over her own deepest desires. The bride was about to leave her own wedding, and somehow they all sensed that once she walked out that door, nothing would ever be the same.
The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant wail of sirens and the rhythmic thrum of helicopters. Natasha stood at the altar, still holding Isaac's hands, her grandmother's wedding dress catching the colored light from stained glass windows that suddenly seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. Every eye in St. Catherine's Church was fixed on her, waiting to see what choice she would make. Isaac squeezed her hands gently. Whatever you're thinking, we can figure it out together, he said softly. The ceremony can wait. We can... No, Natasha interrupted, her voice steady but filled with pain. Isaac, you don't understand. People are dying right now. Every minute we stand here is another minute that trained personnel aren't on scene, aren't setting up proper decontamination protocols, aren't organizing the medical response that could save dozens of lives. She turned to face the congregation, and for the first time, they saw her not as Isaac's bride-to-be, but as someone else entirely. Her posture had shifted into something unmistakably military. Spine straight, shoulders square, chin raised with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "I need to go," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the small sanctuary. "There are people at that explosion site who need immediate medical attention, and the emergency responders don't have the specialized training to handle chemical contamination casualties." Diane Brooks rose from her seat in the front pew, tears streaming down her face. "Sweetheart, this is your wedding day. Surely someone else can—" "Mom," Natasha said gently but firmly, "there is no one else. Not with my training, not with my experience in mass casualty events involving chemical weapons." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Chemical weapons. The congregation exchanged shocked glances as the implications sank in. This wasn't just military service. This was specialized, dangerous, highly classified military service. Captain Sullivan stood up from the fourth row, his expression grave. "Ma'am, you know I can't let you go alone. If you're responding to a CBRN incident, you need proper support." "I know," Natasha replied, already mentally shifting into command mode. "Elena, are you current on your hazmat certifications?" Sergeant Torres nodded sharply. "Yes, ma'am. Renewed them 6 months ago." "Jake?" Lieutenant Morrison was already reaching for his phone. "I can have a support team here in 30 minutes, but that might be too late for the immediate response." Isaac stared at the exchange in growing amazement and confusion. The woman he thought he knew, the quiet, modest woman who helped her elderly neighbors and grew vegetables in her backyard garden, was suddenly speaking in military terminology and commanding the respect of officers he hadn't even realized held significant rank. "What support team?" he asked. "Natasha, what exactly did you do in the Army?" She turned to him, her expression filled with love and regret. "Isaac, you led a specialized unit that responded to chemical and biological weapons attacks in combat zones. I've treated hundreds of casualties from chemical exposure, organized field hospitals in active war zones, and trained emergency response teams across 3 continents." The revelation hit the congregation like a physical blow. Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly. Father Santos nearly dropped his prayer book. And Isaac's mother sank back into her pew as if her legs had given out.
"You never told me," Isaac whispered. "I couldn't," Natasha replied, reaching up to touch his face gently. "Most of my service record is classified. I've been trying to leave that life behind, to build something normal and peaceful with you." Another helicopter thundered overhead, closer this time, and Natasha's head snapped toward the sound with trained precision. "That's a medical evacuation bird," she said. "They're already transporting casualties, which means the contamination zone is larger than initial reports indicated." She turned back to Isaac, her eyes filling with tears for the first time. "I have to go. I'm sorry, I have to go right now." "Then I'm coming with you," Isaac said immediately. "No," Natasha replied, her voice gentle but absolute. "Isaac, you don't have the training for chemical contamination response. You'd be a liability in the hot zone, and I can't do my job if I'm worried about your safety." The brutal honesty of her words cut through any romantic notions about facing danger together. This wasn't a situation where love could overcome practical limitations. This was life and death, and Natasha's training was telling her exactly what needed to happen. She began moving toward the altar rail, her movements now crisp and purposeful. "I need to get out of this dress and into proper gear. Elena, do you have your field kit?" "In my car," Torres replied, already heading toward the church exit. "Jake, contact the field hospital commander and tell them we're inbound with CBRN expertise. Mike,
I need you to coordinate with local emergency management and make sure they understand we're taking operational control of the decontamination procedures." The transformation was complete and stunning. In the span of minutes, the quiet bride had become a commanding officer, issuing orders with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this in far more dangerous circumstances. Chloe stepped forward, still clutching her bouquet. "What about the wedding? What about your dress?" Natasha paused at the altar rail, looking back at the scene she was abandoning. The flowers, the gathered friends and family, the man she loved standing in his wedding suit with an expression of shock and dawning understanding. "The dress will wait," she said quietly. "The people who are dying at Westfield won't." She looked directly at Isaac, her voice breaking slightly for the first time. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but this is who I am. This is what I do." Isaac stared at her for a long moment, processing everything he had just learned about the woman he thought he knew completely. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Go," he said simply. "Save them." The congregation watched in stunned silence as Natasha Brooks, the modest woman who lived quietly on Maple Street, strode purposefully down the aisle of St. Catherine's Church, her grandmother's wedding dress rustling against wooden pews as she moved toward an emergency that would reveal exactly who she really was. Behind her, she left a sanctuary full of people whose understanding of heroism, duty, and sacrifice was about to be permanently transformed.
The parking lot of St. Catherine's Church had been transformed into an impromptu command center within minutes of Natasha's departure from the sanctuary. What the wedding guests witnessed next would forever change their understanding of the woman they thought they knew. Sergeant Torres had retrieved a military-grade duffel bag from her rental car, and the contents she spread across the hood of Isaac's truck told a story that left everyone speechless. Chemical detection equipment, specialized communication devices, protective gear marked with insignia that most civilians would never see, and documentation that bore official seals from agencies that operated far from public view. "Ma'am," Torres said, handing Natasha a tactical vest that looked like it had seen combat. "Your gear from the Afghanistan deployment. I thought you might want it back someday." Natasha took the vest, running her fingers over patches and badges that meant nothing to the watching crowd but everything to those who understood military hierarchy. The Silver Star medal ribbon was there, along with the Bronze Star with V device for valor, the combat medical badge, and several unit commendations that indicated participation in classified operations. "Afghanistan deployment?" Isaac's mother whispered to her sister. "She never mentioned Afghanistan." But it was Captain Sullivan who provided the context that made everyone understand exactly who they had been watching get married. "Elena, show them the article," he said quietly. Torres pulled out her phone and displayed a newspaper clipping from 2 years earlier. The headline read, "Army Major leads heroic rescue after chemical attack in Syria. 47 lives saved in single operation." The accompanying photograph showed a figure in full chemical protective gear, but the caption identified her as Major Natasha M. Brooks, 22nd Chemical Battalion. "Major?" Isaac breathed, staring at the article. "She was a major?" "Lieutenant Colonel by the time she retired," Lieutenant Morrison corrected. "She was offered a full colonel's commission and command of an entire chemical response regiment, but she turned it down to come home and take care of her mother." The revelation hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Lieutenant Colonel. In military terms, that meant Natasha had been responsible for hundreds of soldiers, millions of dollars in equipment, and operations that could affect the outcome of entire campaigns. Diane Brooks, who had remained remarkably composed throughout her daughter's dramatic exit, now sank onto the church steps as the full scope of Natasha's military career became clear. "She never told me. I knew she was decorated, but Lieutenant Colonel? Major operations?" Father Santos approached the group, his face pale with understanding. "The consulting work she does from home," he said slowly. "The government contracts she never talks about. She trains emergency response teams for federal agencies, chemical weapons response protocols, decontamination procedures, mass casualty organization. She's consulted for FEMA, the CDC, and several three-letter agencies I can't name." Meanwhile, Natasha had disappeared into the church's small office to change out of her wedding dress. When she emerged 5 minutes later, the transformation was complete and startling. Gone was the bride in vintage lace, replaced by a figure in military-style tactical gear that fit her with the precision of equipment designed for someone very specific.
The tactical vest bore no name tags or unit insignia. Operational security remained important even in retirement. But everything about her bearing screamed command authority. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her movements were crisp and purposeful, and she carried herself with the unmistakable confidence of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under enemy fire.
"Comms check," she said, fitting a military-grade headset over her ear. The device crackled to life immediately, connecting her to communication networks that extended far beyond local emergency services. "This is Colonel Brooks responding to Westfield's CBRN incident." She spoke into the microphone, her voice carrying the kind of authority that cut through emergency channel chatter. "I'm inbound with specialized personnel and requesting immediate situation report." The response crackled through speakers loud enough for everyone to hear. "Colonel Brooks? Ma'am, thank God, we have estimated 47 casualties with chemical exposure symptoms. Unknown contamination spread, and local emergency services are requesting guidance on decontamination protocols. ETA? 15 minutes, Natasha replied crisply. Establish hot, warm, and cold zones immediately. No personnel enter the hot zone without Level A protection. Begin triage according to chemical casualty care protocols and prepare for field decontamination operations." Isaac stood transfixed as he listened to his bride-to-be coordinate an emergency response with the kind of expertise that spoke of years of similar situations. The woman who brought him homemade cookies and helped elderly neighbors with their groceries was simultaneously someone who could take command of a disaster that had overwhelmed the local emergency services. "Colonel Brooks," Ryan whispered, "she outranks half the National Guard." But it was the next radio transmission that truly drove home the scope of Natasha's reputation. A different voice came through the communications channel, older and carrying even more authority. "Colonel Brooks, this is General Patricia Kane, Fort Bragg. I'm monitoring the situation and prepared to provide additional federal resources if needed." Natasha's entire bearing shifted into something even more formal. "General Kane, good to hear your voice. Situation appears manageable with current resources, but I'll advise if we need additional support." "Outstanding, Natasha. Handle it however you see fit. And Brooks, it's good to have you back in action, even temporarily." The congregation stood in stunned silence as they realized they had just listened to a conversation between their modest neighbor and a general whose name appeared regularly in national news coverage of military operations. Torres approached with the final piece of equipment, a tablet displaying what appeared to be classified emergency response protocols. "Ma'am, the latest CBRN response guidelines, updated since your retirement." Natasha scanned the information with the rapid comprehension of someone who had written similar protocols. "Good. They've incorporated the lessons learned from the Istanbul incident." She paused, looking up at the faces watching her. "Elena, Jake, and Mike, let's move. People are dying while we stand here." As the team loaded into Torres's rental car, Isaac stepped forward. "Natasha, wait." She turned, and for a moment, her expression softened back into the woman he loved. "Isaac, just come back safe. We'll figure out the rest later." She nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I will. I promise." As the car pulled away from St. Catherine's Church, carrying Lieutenant Colonel Natasha Brooks toward an emergency that required her unique expertise, the wedding guests stood in the parking lot processing what they had just witnessed. They had come expecting to see a quiet local woman marry a high school teacher. Instead, they had discovered that their neighbor was a highly decorated combat veteran whose expertise in chemical weapons response had been called upon by generals and federal agencies. The humble woman who lived on Maple Street was actually someone whose courage and skill had saved dozens of lives in some of the world's most dangerous situations. And she had just left her own wedding to do it again.
The first reports from Westfield began filtering back within 30 minutes of Natasha's departure, and what the wedding guests heard through Isaac's firefighter radio transformed their understanding of the woman they thought they knew into something approaching awe. "Field hospital operational under command of Lieutenant Colonel Brooks," crackled the voice of the county emergency coordinator. "Decontamination protocols established, casualty flow organized, and medical treatment prioritized. Estimate casualty count reduced by 60% due to proper initial response procedures." Isaac stood in the church parking lot,
still wearing his wedding suit, listening to reports that described his bride saving lives with the kind of efficiency that spoke of extensive experience in similar situations. Around him, wedding guests who had come expecting a simple ceremony found themselves witnessing something far more profound. "I don't understand," whispered Mrs. Patterson to her husband. "How does someone go from planning a small-town wedding to commanding a disaster response?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Principal Johnson, who had always prided himself on reading people accurately, pulled out his smartphone and began searching. What he found made him call the others over to see. "Look at this," he said, his voice filled with amazement. "This is from 3 years ago. Army Chemical Response Team led by Major Brooks prevents international incident after Syrian chemical attack. And this one, military expert testifies before Congress on chemical weapons response. And here, Distinguished Service Cross awarded for actions under enemy fire." The Distinguished Service Cross. Even those with limited military knowledge understood that this was the second highest decoration for valor, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat situations. Father Santos, who had served as a military chaplain earlier in his career, looked up from reading over Johnson's shoulder with an expression of profound respect. "The Distinguished Service Cross isn't given lightly," he said quietly. "It means she performed acts of heroism that most people can't even imagine." As the group continued searching, a pattern emerged that painted a picture of someone whose expertise and courage had been called upon repeatedly in the world's most dangerous situations. Chemical weapons attacks in Syria, biological contamination incidents in Iraq, training missions across Africa and Eastern Europe, and consultation work with agencies that operated far from public view. "She's been living right here on Maple Street for 2 years," Diane Brooks said, her voice filled with wonder and maternal pride. "Taking care of me, growing tomatoes, volunteering at the church bake sale? And all this time? All this time, she was someone who could have any position she wanted in the military," Captain Sullivan confirmed, having remained behind to help explain the situation to the confused wedding guests. "They offered her command of an entire chemical response regiment, Pentagon positions, training commands that would have made her one of the most influential officers in her field. But she chose to come home and take care of her mother," Isaac said softly, beginning to understand the depth of sacrifice that choice represented. The radio crackled again. "Medical helicopter transport completed successfully. Colonel Brooks has organized the most efficient mass casualty response this county has ever seen. Estimate she's personally saved at least 12 lives in the past hour alone." 12 lives. The number hung in the air as everyone processed what it meant. While they had been standing in a church parking lot trying to understand who Natasha really was, she had been systematically saving a dozen people who would have died without her intervention. "How many people has she saved over her career?" Ryan asked quietly.
Lieutenant Morrison, who had also remained behind, considered the question seriously. In direct medical intervention, probably hundreds. In terms of training other responders, preventing attacks, developing protocols that are used worldwide, thousands, maybe tens of thousands. The scope was almost incomprehensible. The quiet woman who helped elderly Mr. Jameson with his groceries and never missed a church potluck had spent years preventing disasters that could have killed thousands of people. Isaac's phone rang, and he saw Natasha's number on the display. The parking lot fell silent as he answered on speaker. "Isaac, I'm sorry I can't talk long," came her voice, slightly muffled by protective equipment, but still unmistakably hers. "We've got the situation stable, but I'll be here for several more hours overseeing the decontamination process." "Don't apologize," Isaac said immediately. "Are you safe?" "I'm fine. This is what I'm trained for." There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more personal. "Isaac, I know this changes things. I know this isn't what you thought you were signing up for when you proposed." Before Isaac could respond, his mother stepped forward and spoke loud enough for the phone to pick up her voice. "Natasha, this is Patricia Turner. I want you to know that we are all incredibly proud of you. What you did today, leaving your own wedding to save people, that takes a kind of courage most of us can't even comprehend." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd.
These were people who had thought they were attending the wedding of a nice local woman to their beloved teacher and firefighter. Instead, they had witnessed something that would become legend in Pinehurst, the day a bride left her own wedding to command a disaster response that saved dozens of lives. "Mrs. Turner, Natasha's voice caught slightly. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Chloe stepped closer to the phone. "Natasha, we're not going anywhere. When you're done saving the world, we'll be right here." A new voice came through in the background, authoritative and crisp. "Colonel Brooks, we need you in the command tent." "On my way," Natasha replied, then spoke back into the phone. "I have to go. There's still work to do." "We love you," Isaac said simply. "Come home when you can." After the call ended, the group stood in contemplative silence. They were beginning to understand that they hadn't just witnessed someone choosing duty over personal happiness, they had witnessed someone whose entire life had been dedicated to service at a level most people never see. "She could have told everyone who she was," Father Santos observed. "She could have lived off her reputation, demanded special treatment, expected recognition for her service. Instead, she chose to live quietly and serve her community in small ways, because that's who she is." As the afternoon wore on and more reports filtered in about the successful response at Westfield, word began to spread throughout Pinehurst about what had really happened at St. Catherine's Church. The story that emerged wasn't just about a woman who left her wedding for an emergency. It was about the discovery that one of their neighbors was a genuine American hero who had been living among them without fanfare or recognition. By evening, when Natasha finally returned to Pinehurst, she would find that everything had changed. Not just because her secret was out, but because an entire community had learned something profound about the nature of true heroism and the quiet courage of those who serve others without expecting anything in return.
The sun was beginning to set over Pinehurst when Natasha finally returned to St. Catherine's Church, still wearing her tactical gear, but with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who had accomplished something significant. She found Isaac waiting on the church steps, still in his wedding suit, though he had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves during the long afternoon of waiting. "How bad was it?" he asked as she approached, noting the chemical detection equipment still clipped to her vest and the faint smell of decontamination chemicals that clung to her gear. 43 casualties total, but only 2 serious enough for extended hospitalization, Natasha replied, settling beside him on the stone steps. "If the local responders had gone in without proper protocols, we could have lost a dozen people to secondary contamination alone." Isaac nodded, processing the magnitude of what she had prevented. "And now?" "Cleanup will take weeks, but the immediate danger is over. The chemical release was contained, decontamination procedures are complete, and the field hospital is transitioning to standard medical care." She paused, looking at the church where they should have been celebrating their wedding reception. "Isaac, I need you to understand something about what happened today." "I'm listening." Natasha was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "When I left the army, I thought I was done with all of that. I wanted a normal life, a quiet life, with you. I wanted to be just Natasha Brooks, who grows vegetables and helps her neighbors and marries the man she loves in a small church. But..." She trailed off, struggling to articulate something that had driven her entire adult life. "I can't be the person who stays safe while others suffer because I didn't want to get involved." Isaac took her hand, noting the calluses from years of military service and the faint scarring from chemical burns that most people assumed came from gardening accidents. "Is that what you think I'd want? For you to ignore people who needed help?" "I don't know," Natasha admitted. "I know this isn't what you signed up for when you proposed. I know having a wife who might disappear at any moment to handle emergencies isn't exactly the peaceful life you were planning." Before Isaac could respond, they heard footsteps approaching. Father Santos emerged from the church, followed by a small group of wedding guests who had remained throughout the afternoon, unwilling to leave until they knew Natasha was safe. "Colonel Brooks?" Father Santos said,
using her military title with obvious respect. "We owe you an apology." Natasha looked confused. An apology? For what? "For not understanding who you really are," Patricia Turner said, stepping forward with tears in her eyes. "For assuming that because you lived quietly and modestly, you were ordinary. I am ordinary. I just have some specialized training that happened to be needed today."
Diane Brooks, who had spent the afternoon learning things about her daughter's military service that left her simultaneously proud and terrified, shook her head firmly. "Sweetheart, what you did today, what you've been doing your entire career, that's not ordinary. That's extraordinary." Chloe approved carrying something wrapped in tissue paper. "We found this in your gear bag," she said, revealing Natasha's grandmother's wedding dress, carefully folded and protected. "We thought you might want it back." Natasha took the dress, running her fingers over the vintage lace that had seemed so important that morning and now felt like a relic from another lifetime. "I'm sorry," she said to the group. "I'm sorry your wedding was ruined, that your day was disrupted, that you had to learn about my background this way." "Ruined?" Ryan stepped forward, his expression incredulous. "Natasha, we didn't witness a ruined wedding. We witnessed something much more important. We saw what real courage looks like." Principal Johnson nodded in agreement. "In 30 years of education, I've talked to students about heroism, about service, about putting others before yourself. Today, I actually got to see it in action." "You saved 43 people," Mrs. Patterson added, her voice filled with awe. "43 families who will go to bed tonight with their loved ones safe because you were willing to leave your own wedding." Isaac stood up, still holding Natasha's hand. "She's right," he said, his voice carrying a new understanding. "I thought I was marrying someone wonderful, but I was actually marrying someone extraordinary. And the fact that you don't see it that way, that you think this was just doing your job, that makes it even more remarkable." Father Santos cleared his throat. "If I may, I think there's a lesson here for all of us. We live in a world where we often mistake fame for importance, wealth for worth, and recognition for respect. But true heroism often wears ordinary clothes and lives on quiet streets and never asks for applause." He gestured toward Natasha, still in her tactical gear, but looking somehow vulnerable under the attention. "This woman has spent years saving lives, preventing disasters, training others to do the same work. She could have demanded recognition, could have used her service record to gain position or prestige. Instead, she chose to live among us quietly, to serve our community in small ways while carrying the knowledge that she had served her country in ways most of us can't imagine." The group stood in contemplative silence as the full weight of this lesson settled over them. They had learned something profound about the nature of true service, about the heroes who walk among us without fanfare, about the courage required to choose duty over comfort again and again. "So, what happens now?" Isaac asked, looking at his bride, who was still technically his bride-to-be. Natasha smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed since the sirens interrupted their ceremony. "We get married now," she said simply, "if you'll still have me, knowing that this might happen again." Isaac's answer came without hesitation. "Natasha, I fell in love with someone who brings soup to sick neighbors and helps elderly people with their groceries. Learning that you also happen to save the world on a regular basis doesn't change that. It just makes me love you more." 6 months later, St. Catherine's Church looked remarkably similar to how it had on that May afternoon when sirens interrupted a wedding ceremony. The same wooden pews, the same stained glass windows, the same worn stone steps where Isaac and Natasha now sat on a crisp October morning, watching their breath form small clouds in the cool air. But everything else had changed in ways that rippled far beyond Pinehurst's town limits. The story of the bride who left her wedding to command a disaster response had spread throughout the region, then the state, and eventually across the country. News outlets picked up the story, veterans organizations shared it, and emergency response communities used it as an example of what dedicated service really looked like. Another interview request,
Isaac said, showing Natasha an email on his phone from a national morning show. They want to do a segment on everyday heroes. Natasha shook her head, just as she had turned down dozens of similar requests over the past months. "I'm not a hero," she said, the same response she gave every time. "I'm just someone who did what needed to be done." Isaac smiled, long since accustomed to his wife's complete inability to see herself the way others saw her. They had completed their wedding ceremony that evening in May, surrounded by the same guests who had witnessed her departure hours earlier. The ceremony had been brief and simple, but it had carried a weight of understanding that made it more meaningful than any elaborate celebration could have been. "The fire department wants to know if you'll teach another chemical response course," Isaac continued, scrolling through messages. "And the county emergency coordinator is asking if you'd consider taking a consulting position." "I might do the training course," Natasha replied thoughtfully. The local responders did well at Westfield, but they could use more specialized education. This had become the pattern of their life together. Natasha continuing to serve her community and beyond, but now without the secrecy that had once surrounded her background. She had developed training programs for regional emergency response teams, consulted on chemical safety protocols for local industries, and occasionally traveled to provide expertise for federal agencies when situations required her unique qualifications. "Mrs. Johnson called. She wants to know if you'll speak to her high school chemistry class about career options." "That I'll do," Natasha said immediately. Education had become one of her passions, particularly inspiring young people to consider careers in service. Though I suspect she really wants me to talk about that day at Westfield. Can you blame her? You've become something of a local legend. It was true, though Natasha remained uncomfortable with the attention. In Pinehurst, she was no longer just the quiet woman who lived on Maple Street. She was Colonel Brooks, the hero who had saved dozens of lives, the decorated veteran who had chosen service over personal comfort time and again. But the real changes went deeper than recognition or reputation. The story of what happened at St. Catherine's Church had sparked conversations about service, sacrifice, and the heroes who walk among us, unrecognized. Veterans across the country had shared their own stories of returning to civilian life while carrying skills and experiences that set them apart. Emergency responders had talked about the dedication required to choose dangerous duty over personal safety. Most importantly, communities had begun to look more carefully at their neighbors, wondering what untold stories of service and sacrifice might be hidden behind ordinary appearances. "I got an email from Elena," Natasha said, checking her own phone. "She's been asked to speak at a military transition seminar about finding purpose after service."
Good for her. What did you tell her?
That helping other veterans understand they can serve their communities in new ways might be the most important mission any of us undertake. This had become Natasha's deeper calling, helping other military personnel transition from active duty while finding ways to continue serving. She had quietly begun mentoring veterans, helping them recognize that their skills and dedication remained valuable even outside the military structure. A car pulled up in front of the church, and they watched as an elderly man got out, using a walker to steady himself. Mr. Jameson had been one of the casualties at Westfield, suffering chemical exposure that required weeks of treatment. He had made a full recovery, thanks in large part to the proper initial response that Natasha had organized. "Colonel Brooks," he called, making his careful way toward them, "I wanted to thank you again." "Mr. Jameson, you don't need to thank me. I'm just glad you're feeling better." "I'm alive because you knew what to do. My grandchildren still have their grandfather because you were willing to leave your own wedding. That deserves thanks, whether you want to hear it or not." As they helped Mr. Jameson into the church for Sunday service, Isaac reflected on the profound changes the past months had brought. He had married the woman he loved, but he had also gained a deeper understanding of what love really meant. Supporting someone's calling even when it required sacrifice, celebrating someone's gifts even when they made your life more complicated. and finding pride in being married to someone whose dedication to others exceeded any personal ambition. The bells of St. Catherine's began to ring, calling the community to worship. As they had every Sunday since their wedding, Isaac and Natasha would sit together in the same pew where she had once sat as simply the quiet woman who helped her aging mother. Now she sat as someone whose courage and expertise had become legendary, but who still brought homemade soup to sick neighbors and never missed a church potluck. As they entered the sanctuary where their wedding had been interrupted by duty and completed by choice, they carried with them the knowledge that some stories transcend the people who live them. The story of the bride who chose service over ceremony had become larger than their personal experience. It had become a testament to the quiet heroes who walk among us, the veterans who continue to serve after their official duty ends, and the truth that real courage often wears ordinary clothes and lives on quiet streets. The lesson that began with sirens interrupting wedding vows had grown into something that would inspire others for years to come. That true heroism isn't about recognition or reward, but about the willingness to put others' needs before your own, no matter the personal cost. And sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones who never think of themselves as heroes at all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.